When we look at films, TV series, and video games set in the historical era, we often expect them to present us with an engaging representation of the past. Even fantasy franchises, firmly rooted in fiction, present us with worlds which are undeniably coded to real-world historical cultures, and thus can still dramatically impact an audience's understanding and information about the past. Indeed, franchises like Dungeons & Dragons, The Lord of the Rings, and Game of Thrones have had a major impact on the public perception of the past, such as what living conditions were like, the prevalence or perspective of slavery, and how we should understand sexual violence in history. These and other major or contentious issues are often affected by the media we consume. Why then do so many films choose to make egregious mistakes in their portrayals? Today, we'll dive into the history of arms and armor in media as a lens to understand why our portrayals of the past are the way they are, and what can be done to improve them.
This video is sponsored by you. Unfortunately, the YouTube environment is not great right now, with the algorithm being friendlier to drama and react channels and YouTube being permissive of AI slop. We don't do drama and we don't do AI, but thanks to our members and patrons, our channel continues to make 3 public videos per week, with the team intact and going strong. In recognition of their generosity and contributions, members and patrons receive 2 additional exclusive videos each week, and access many other perks. Join them to watch more than 250 exclusive videos covering every era of history. Join them by scanning the QR code on your screen, via the links in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video.
In order to understand our modern portrayal of the past in film, we have to go back through the history of media itself, to its roots in ancient and medieval theatre. The idea of costumes and sets has been around for thousands of years, and costume armors were already present in ancient Greece and Rome. Classical artists, poets, orators, and playwrights were trained on a set curriculum, with learning texts analogous to the later curriculum of the medieval university. Their plays reflected their contemporary understanding of their past, and tended to be inflexible to radical new ideas due to traditionalism inherent in their training. Many people understood that the past was different from their own time. In fact, the first archaeological expedition in recorded history was undertaken by Nabonidus of Babylon in the 530s BCE. Moreover, artifacts were available and visible to artists and playwrights, as offerings in temples could sometimes last hundreds of years in various states of preservation, and most ancient and medieval libraries also doubled as archives and museums. Nevertheless, to ancient and later playwrights, the stories they told were more than just a reflection of their past, but also a commentary on their contemporary present, just like films and video games today. When Aristophanes wrote his plays, such as his Knights or Wasps, these satires were a commentary on the politics of his time, specifically targeting Athenian generals like Cleon or the Athenian courts. This is little different from Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, serving as a criticism of US imperialism and the military-industrial complex. However, when it came to ancient or mythological events like Homer's Iliad or Sophocles' Oedipus and Antigone, the past that historical playwrights imagined was one based on their contemporary reality. The difference was that their contemporary reality partially reflected this imagined past due to cultural continuity, at least in certain ways. Colourful costumes, painted armour, and vibrant sets all reflected both their contemporary reality but also their past, because these design decisions were made due to the conservatism of their artistic traditions and educational system. This fusion of the contemporary and the idea of a specific past led to the tropes of Greek or Roman arms and armour that continue to influence us today. One example of this is the statue of Antoninus Pius in the Palazzo al Temps in Rome, where we see a folded-over fabric or leather muscle cuirass hanging above a Corinthian-style inspired helmet, with cheekpieces attached to its base. The sculptors, like those who painted murals or designed sets, were trained using pre-existing works and classical models of learning, so they perpetuated what they saw passed down from antiquity. However, their exposure to their contemporary reality was through theatre itself, as they rarely saw actual armed soldiers in Rome or Athens. Thus, the flexible, colourful, lightweight costumes that were used in theatre plays were then used to adorn carvings of Augustus, Antoninus Pius, or Honorius, long after muscle cuirasses themselves disappeared from the archaeological record. Suddenly, this facet of Greco-Roman art was picked up again in costume armour from the late 1500s through the late 1700s, and it continues to this day. Costume artists of that time looked at, interpreted, and attempted to understand ancient costumes, and their understandings became mainstays of costume making in theatre, opera, and film. A modern example of this process misinterpretation, perpetuating a historical misconception, comes in the form of studded leather armour, which originated with the original Dungeons & Dragons by Gary Gygax, as a result of misinterpreting historical examples of a European coat of plates. This was then perpetuated by costume designers for multiple reasons, one of which was contemporary 1970s and 1980s counterculture fashion, a circle which overlapped with fantasy gamers and consumers, as well as with costume designers and filmmakers. The same can be said for early filmmakers, whose exposure to ancient costumes was through theatre and opera, as well as early 20th century nationalist displays. Costumes of the early days of the silent film and the emergence of the epic sword-and-sandal film were directly influenced by the arms and armour of these displays, be they interpretations of ancient arms and armour stemming from the very late medieval and Enlightenment artists, medieval armour itself, or even early modern military uniforms. These were vibrant, colourful, and evocative interpretations, like we see in Cleopatra, Ben-Hur, Jason and the Argonauts, Spartacus, and a myriad of other epic films of the early to mid-20th century. In many ways, it was the Vietnam War that began to change the classic war film, from washed-over tales of daring and heroism to the gritty, dark, and seemingly realistic tales of soldiers' perseverance, battlefield horrors, and survival. Ultimately, this gradually grew more and more exacerbated as other elements of filmmaking evolved through the 1980s and 1990s, ultimately leading to Gladiator. Ridley Scott's groundbreaking film took the bright, colourful sword-and-sandal epic with its spaghetti western lighting and summer palette and traded it for the dark lighting and grimy realism of a modern war film. Almost every historical drama and fantasy film of the 2000s, barring arguably much of Lord of the Rings and Alexander, picked up on the success of this portrayal. This is not to say that black-coloured costumes and smoke-filled battlefields didn't exist before Gladiator. The idea of blackness and its association with impurity developed with 7th century Christianity, and can be seen in medieval art itself, often used to depict or describe foreigners, like the Arabic peoples, or even the Byzantines. J.R.R. Tolkien, a linguist with a deep understanding of both the early Germanic epic and the medieval romances of his native England, had a major impact on turning these tropes into fundamental building blocks of fantasy as a genre. Thus, we continue to see black armour, or costumes representing our flawed, supposedly realistic anti-heroes or impure villains on screen, ranging from the skeletons of Army of Darkness to Geralt of Rivia in the Witcher TV series. This has simply become more exacerbated over time. Conversely, the idea of white armour representing goodness, virtue, and purity has also persisted since the Middle Ages. In its original context, white armour refers to steel armour that had been finished to a presentable smoothness, but was not necessarily mirror-finished. From about 1370 to 1470, a white cuirass became the symbol of knightly virtue in late medieval romance. With the invention of the cuirass in North Italy, fashion composed the majority of armors on the battlefield at that time, communicating one's social status as a man-at-arms or higher. Many armors were colored with oxide finishes, or covered with brightly colored fabrics, a style which probably composed the majority of armors before and after this about 100-year interval, which were later removed due to the preservation practices of various conservators of both private and museum collections, extending well into the 1900s. These armors then influenced early theatre and film, resulting in the wall of steel-clad soldiers we see in Henry V, Jeanne d'Arc, or even Army of Darkness. The survival of these cleaned or original pieces in large collections was also a contributing factor to why some of these older films had more accurate arms and armor, whereas many major examples of ancient armor often had yet to be excavated and exposed to the general public. If we look at a film like Henry V or Jeanne d'Arc, we can see a reasonable interpretation of early 15th century medieval armor, barring some inaccuracies that would not be perceptible to those outside of historical reenactment or academia. So why then does the design of arms and armor go from flawed but genuine attempts at reflecting their historical reality to the almost biker gang-looking costumes of Vikings, or the completely alien armor of the Nilfgaardian soldiers in The Witcher? One reason is the medium of the costume. Fundamentally, most actors do not wish to wear metal armor. They are not in the same physical shape as a competition-rated historical fencer, much less a Roman legionary or medieval man-at-arms. Furthermore, acting itself presents its own challenges and physical exertions through body language and facial expressions. Actors like Viggo Mortensen, who notoriously wore his metal mail habergeon for long periods on and off set, tend to be a rare exception in modern filmmaking. The advent of lightweight modern materials like injection-molded or vacuum-formed plastic for armor dramatically impacted what kinds and shapes of armor could be made, with film costume diverging more and more towards its own modern art form, rather than a historical tradition of costume making, much less of the actual art of armoring. Another failure is that concept artists and costume designers, unlike most historical armorers, lack a necessary understanding of biomechanics, the science of body movement, which fundamentally governs both the art of fencing and armor design. Just like with a modern sport, there are reasons you don't perform certain actions in fencing, because the body just isn't designed to move that way. The same can be said of armor, which limits movement if it is improperly designed. While modern people often perceive plate armor as bulky, clumsy, and restrictive, historical examples were not, and are even described as being like a second skin of iron, due to the way they were made and fitted. Daniel Jacquet has demonstrated in his doctoral research how a modern infantryman or firefighter in fact often has worse mobility than a medieval knight in developed plate armor, which is primarily due to the fit and the distribution of weight on the body. This brings us to our first point of why modern film armor so often fails: the fundamental shape. Historical armor is governed by body movement and fashion, and many costumes fail to take this into reality. Many torso armors are produced to lengths too long to accommodate the bending of the waist, whereas ancient and medieval armors typically ended at the lower ribs or upper stomach. Many modern costumes and reenactors' armors often fall much lower, down to the hips or even the groin, due to a lack of proper fitting. This problem extends to the limbs and hands with plate armor, which can extend too far down the arm or leg, restricting the movement of the wrist, elbow, ankle, or knee. Improper shape can lead to the restriction of muscle on the upper arm, forearm, calf, or thigh as well. This is why, on a suit of armor, certain joints will have gaps in the armor and be protected by a more flexible material, like mail. Of course, some fantasy designs have features that would utterly prevent movement at all if brought outside of a video game model. and this can really be seen as a failure of the design process from concept through to production, a fact which also applies to film. Lamination of the joints was developed already by the first decade of the 1400s, but was vulnerable to deformation due to the narrow thickness of the plates, as well as penetration by weapons. Another major reason why armor design in modern filmmaking fails is that it doesn't understand how armor fails. Often, we see armor in films that offer no deflection or resistance to a weapon. Sometimes for the purpose of a dramatic demise of a critical character, sometimes to emphasize the intensity of a battle, or sometimes for no particular reason at all. The historical reality was different. Proofing of armor extends at least into the 14th century, meaning that armor was tested before being sold, which was often a legal requirement of the artisans' guilds that produced them. These armors were proofed against lances, bows, and crossbows, proving they would not penetrate, and later, early firearms. Evidence from bioarchaeological studies of mass graves shows a pattern in the wounds received in battle, suggesting that historical combatants explicitly targeted unarmored parts of the body, like the limbs, although this may be affected by some form of bias in the sample due to the wearing of armor itself. These wounds appear for the same reason a modern infantryman may choose not to armor certain parts of his body on certain missions where mobility is considered useful. In fact, this is a leading hypothesis as to why limb armor is so absent from the artistic and archaeological record of the Roman and Byzantine armies, as the frontline infantryman simply favored mobility of the limbs. Gaps, lamination, and coverage served a purpose, as well as features on armor plates themselves. The V-shaped stop ribs on late 14th and early 15th century plate cuirasses were positioned because the globose shape of the cuirass often deflected broken or intact arrowheads into the area of the neck. This brings us to a final failure in understanding: fashion. Costume designers are well aware of fashion trends in clothing, even if many films struggle to translate real historical fashion itself. However, armor also followed fashion, and these fashions could differ between cultures and time periods. The Greeks used a metal oxidation technique to blue their bronze helmets, and also painted them, while the Romans preferred to polish them to a high sheen, emulating gold or silver in an almost proto-fascista style. Coat of plates and cuirasses of the 14th to early 16th centuries followed the tailoring of menswear and the development of the doublet, narrowing from a weasel waist to a wasp waist that would be considered almost feminine in shape today, despite the deflection of the globose form into the neck or shoulder regions. The Germans took the globose shape and created the angular Kasten bust, recently featured in Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. And eventually both Italian and German fashion moved towards the goose belly profile in the mid-16th century, with the introduction of a medial ridge. A similar development can be found in shoes, where the pointed toe of the men's shoe of the mid-15th century became drawn out into what is known as the piked shoon, with its extremely long point, a fashion which is reflected in the armoured sabaton. This then fell out of fashion with extreme rapidity around the turn of the 16th century, as shoe fashion moved towards a curved, naturalistic toe of the shoe. Oftentimes, these developments in armour fashion also reflect a conservatism and continuity in traditional craftsmanship, and the training of new generations of artisans, broken only by major revolutions in technology or society. An excellent example of this is the Germanic migrations, where the late Roman ridge helmet disappears from the archaeological record, and the early Byzantine Spangenhelm or band helmet is introduced, which seems to reflect an influx of steppe and Gothic armourers into the arms factories of the Eastern Roman Empire. Fundamentally, fantasy armour has no trend in fashion, innovation, or societal change to follow, unless the author writes it, and this often affects why it fails to make an impression on the viewer, particularly in a film where there is no space to provide such explanations. What changes, then, can be made to fix these problems in film and media? Costume making is its own tradition, intertwined and yet separate from the worlds of fencing, fashion history, art history, and armory. Costumers are not completely in the dark about the criticism. Still, it is an industry with thousands of people, each with their own specialties and interests, and held to the demands and whims of producers, directors, and budgets. In many ways, it is also a failure of the audience to understand filmmaking. The more we can encourage those in the film industry to learn the history, language, traditional crafts, and cultural history of the historical peoples who influence the film and video games they create, then the better those films and video games will become. This is not a change that can come overnight, but it is one that the efforts of dedicated and passionate people and organizations are gradually bringing about. We hope you found this video thought-provoking and informative. More like it are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200 exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one. Every week, we release 3 new exclusive videos for our members and patrons: Pacific War, Eastern Front of World War II Prelude, and many other series, including the War of Spanish Succession, Punic Wars, Iberian Reconquista, Russian Revolution and Civil War, North African and Italian campaigns of World War II, and much more can be found by pressing the link in the description or pinned comment, or by pressing the join button under the video. There are more than 200 videos never seen anywhere else. Thanks for supporting us.